Okay, why don't we get started? Welcome everybody. My name is David Wilkins. I'm the director on the Center of the Legal Profession here at Harvard Law School, but for purposes of today, I'm also the director of the project on globalization, lawyers, and emerging economies, which we are delighted to talk about today, and particularly our work on Brazil. So I thought I'd just give you a little bit of background about the project, about what its aims and ambitions are, and then I'm going to turn it over to my co-conspirator and collaborator, who many of you know, Professor David Trubek from University of Wisconsin Law School, and probably the world's leading authority on law and development, and one of the world's leading experts on Brazil, who's been studying it for many years, who's going to kind of locate the project in Brazil in the context of what we're learning about the overall context of what's happening in Brazil. And then we are really thrilled to have the leaders of our Brazilian research, Luciana Cunha and José Garcez Ghirardi, and I may not have gotten that pronunciation quite right in Portuguese, but that no fala Portuguese, I'm very sorry, even though it's my favorite country in the world. But they have been doing just absolutely terrific work, organizing a team of researchers who have now come back with some pretty important findings about Brazil, which are eventually going to be incorporated in a book, and they'll give you a sense of that substance. And then we're very happy because really, by virtue of the fact that I was in Brazil about 2 weeks ago, and I was in Brasilia, and I met a terrific lawyer there who was very kind to me and introduced me to many people in Brasilia, including the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and the Minister of Education and others. And we got to talking, and I said we were doing this program, and he said, "Oh, I think this would be very interesting, and maybe I'll come." And so he's flown all the way from Brasilia to be with us, and we actually have a real live Brazilian corporate lawyer who will tell us a little bit about his impressions about what we're finding, and that's Tiago Sebras, who's over here on, I guess that's your left, my right. So just a little background about the project. So the project is called Globalization, Lawyers, and Emerging Economies, or GLEE, as we like to call it, after the popular TV show. Dave Trubek is the king of acronyms, and he gets total credit for coming up with that. But the name really does describe what the project is how is globalization reshaping the market for legal services, particularly in the important emerging economies of the world, of which we have started with Brazil, India, and China. We were actually going to do all the BRICS in the initial wave, but we haven't quite figured out Russia yet, so we're putting that to one side. But we're likely actually to take the project to South Africa and other places in Africa in the near future. The project starts with a very simple set of premises, right? So if you ask why have Brazil, India, and China emerged in the last decade or 2 decades, it's because at some point there was a decision made to open up their economies more or less to the global economy. And that more or less is important, and there are varying degrees, but in all the countries that's been a central feature. That then creates 2 things really right off the bat. One is privatization of previously state-owned assets, and the second is a significant amount of foreign investment into the country. Once you have these things, it doesn't take you long to realize as a country that you need new laws and new legal structures to regulate this new kind of enterprise and activity, and the relationship between the domestic economy and the global economy. So you need trade law, you need investment law, you might need different kinds of securities laws, tax laws. You need to understand how to operate in the institutions of global governance, like the WTO or the IMF or the World Bank. Once you begin to develop a new kind of legal framework, it doesn't take you long to realize as a country you need new kinds of lawyers, or at least lawyers with new kinds of skills that can operate in these new regulatory environments and again interface between the domestic legal environment and the global environment. The GLEE project is designed to study this interaction. And it starts with the place where you see this interaction most evident, and that is the creation in all of these countries of something like a newly emerging or newly important corporate legal sector. A legal sector that is designed primarily to look at the needs and the interests of increasingly important corporate interests, whether those interests are domestically grown, state-owned enterprises, private companies that are developed in these jurisdictions, or the legal needs of the companies who are coming into the market via foreign direct investment joint ventures or other things. The GLEE project starts with examining this newly emerging corporate sector in each of the countries, but then tries to understand the way in which that sector is itself influencing other parts of the legal ecosystem, from legal education to traditional legal elites to the pro bono and public interest practice to the way in which law and the state are working to develop the regulatory state of the political economy of the country. We now have as many as 50 researchers who are researching these things on the ground in each of the three countries, sort of 50 altogether, and it's a multinational and multidisciplinary team. That is, in fact, that's one of the commitments of the project. So there's some people like me who bring legal expertise, mostly coming from a US background, but then we have, as you will see, talented researchers who are in each of the countries from other disciplines such as sociology, economics, political science, comparative law. And the goal is to build grounded theory from the ground up, to start with the empirical reality as best we can understand it on the ground, and to understand then what that says to us about what's happening in the legal profession, how it's affecting the overall market for legal services, and how that's not just in the countries themselves, but more globally. So in other words, it's a small project with modest ambitions. So with that, let me turn it over to my colleague Dave Trubek and to talk a little bit about how the overall Brazilian context is shaping our work.
It's a great honor to be here and be part of the organization that David referred to in his introduction as the center of the legal profession.
Oh, no, sorry. Well, we think that too. We're
a slip of the tongue, but perhaps very revealing as we look around. Okay, so if you had been in Brazil in the 1980s, you would have seen a closed economy, that is, closed off from the international trade, lots of restrictions on imports, not too much emphasis on exports, although there was some exports, of course. A very strong role for the state with a very significant percentage of all economic activity in the hands of state-owned enterprises, and an authoritarian regime. The waning of this authoritarian regime, which gradually was waning through the 80s. By the early 90s, everything had started to change in very dramatic ways. So you could summarize it as democratization, stabilization, liberalization, and privatization. So democratization with the Constitution of 1988, you had a major move toward creating a genuine democratic system with substantial rights, both civil and social and economic rights built into the Constitution. You had stabilization of the economy. I didn't mention, of course, the fact that until this time there was severe inflation reaching runaway proportions. And through a very brilliant plan called the Real Plan, the economy was stabilized and macroeconomic stabilization became a major part of Brazil's political economy. The economy was liberalized, that is, tariffs were lowered, barriers to trade reduced, not completely, but significantly, and a big swath of the state-owned enterprise sector was privatized. For example, the telecommunications field was privatized, many other areas. That did not mean complete privatization, and there still remains many important state-owned enterprises, of which the largest and probably best known is Petrobras, which is the gas and oil enterprise, but also the three largest banks in Brazil are state-owned. So the parts of the financial sector remains state-owned. Brazil followed the sort of route that David has suggested that we see in all three countries. That is, a whole new set of laws were needed, and other laws were eliminated. So you had a whole new legal scene, of which there are many, many examples, but in the areas that were privatized, for example, telecommunications, it was necessary to create regulatory bodies that would monitor these newly privatized sectors. So you had a whole body of regulatory law. This was the period in which the Uruguay round had been completed, and Brazil became subject to a lot of the disciplines of the WTO disciplines that had not applied before. So you had a series of new rules emanating from the World Trade Organization. There was an effort to expand exports, and that led to a lot of changes, including the desire to attract foreign investment, which would help finance export-oriented industries. So there was bringing in foreign investment. And there was a decision to build a domestic capital market. This was actually an old plan. There was an effort that goes back as far as the 60s to build an effective domestic capital market, but it hadn't really gotten anywhere. But in the 90s and into the new century, the Bovespa, the Sao Paulo Stock Exchange, was built up to be a major source of capital for companies, and that required the creation of a whole body of securities law that had not been in existence, or at least had been not very important. And then another area, of course, was the strengthening of the antitrust regime. So all of these things brought the kind of legal changes to Brazil. And at the same time that there were new laws, there were new kinds of clients because of both the presence of foreign corporations that were doing business in Brazil, but also the growth of large Brazilian multinationals, which were beginning to play a role on the global scene, and therefore begin to think in terms that were more common among global firms. So you had new laws, new clients, and that, of course, created a whole set of challenges to a legal profession that had not been particularly internationalized, particularly oriented toward large-scale corporate legal practice. There were, of course, a few small corporate firms that go back as far as the 60s. When I was a lawyer in Brazil in the 60s, I worked with a firm called Pinheiro Neto, which is now considered one of the top firms in the country, was then, and it had 30 lawyers, and it was the largest firm in the country by a factor of 4, I believe, 4 or 5. But there weren't 40 other firms like that, and there were a few others that grew up in that period. But basically, this was not a legal profession set up and organized to deal with this tidal wave of law, clients, and economic activity that suddenly hit Brazil, starting, I guess, I don't know, mid-90s. And so that's that was the base from which the studies in Brazil that the GLE project is carrying out started. That's it.
And with that, the stars of the show, Luciana and José.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank David Wilkins and David Trubek, and also Brian and Hakim, who prepared this meeting with the students at Harvard Law School. It's a pleasure to be here and to show some of our very first results about the GLI project in Brazil. Me and my colleague, José, we are from this very unique and new law school in Brazil, from Fundação Getúlio Vargas Law School from São Paulo, which was born in the age of globalization and has the internationalization and also the academic research in the law field, one of our aims and roles in on the students' education. This meeting and this is not the final steps, as I have already said. This is the first results of our research in Brazil, but we now can offer a broad view of the Brazilian legal profession in the age of globalization. We have covered. Yep. Okay, we have covered 7 topics relation to the legal profession: general in-house, counsel, legal education, building legal capacity, which means that how we can build the capacity to deal with global economic law, elite corporate law firms, regulation of legal profession, pro bono, and also the meaning of gender in legal profession, and what's the impact of globalization in relation to the gender. Although the research covers different areas, there are some common traits worth stressing. There has been an undeniable change in the landscape of the legal profession, mainly since the 90s. This change is intrinsically linked to the opening of Brazilian economy and the larger role played by international corporations in the country. Just some numbers to show what this means. In 2014, we have 30,000 law firms registered in Brazil, and approximately 8,000 offices involved in business law. In all over the country, this means that we have 872,396 lawyers. And the São Paulo and Rio field, where we did our research, represent 46% of the field. This new scenario has worked to change institutions, practices, institutes, hierarchical professional structures, and the political dynamics of actors in the legal field. And the paradigm of the American law firm has clashed with the traditional legal culture in Brazil. This has created new institutional designs and patterns of actions, ranging from more or less direct import of foreign models, like general counsel, to creative innovations, like pro bono work, for example, to deadlocks, as we can see in regulation, and also in law firms' way of work. And sometimes to mix designs as legal education, law firms, gender, and building capacity. In each area, different actors play more or less pronounced roles in the creation of global lawyers in Brazil, or on the prevention of it. The regulatory setting for this new legal perspective and activity. Perhaps the most controversial area, unsurprisingly, is that the law firms and the limits of their action, and most remarkably, their joint actions and association with foreign law firms. Both the law firm paper and also the regulation paper suggested that, first, top corporate law firms, mainly in São Paulo and Rio, are moving towards an international model and standard of professional practice, breaking away from the traditional family-owned model that still prevails in some areas. Second, the diversity of the country with the sharp differences in economic activities that could characterize the various regions works to concentrate the bulk of the transformation of law firms in the southeast of the country, leaving mostly untouched the rest of the country. And third, the Bar Association in Brazil has adopted a conservative market protection stance once it deems the presence of foreign cooperation with Brazilian offices a threat for the market for Brazilian lawyers. Again, this is mainly in São Paulo and to a lesser extent in Rio, Minas, and Rio Grande do Sul. With regard to the size of the offices in the database operating in the business sector, we note that within the scope of 367 offices surveyed, only 10 have more than 300 lawyers. The majority of the offices are small and medium in size. Most of them have 11 to 20 lawyers. In addition, there are 54 business law offices with up to 10 lawyers and another 54 that have 21 to 30 lawyers. The general in-house shows that the Brazil follows a similar pattern of change observed in other countries. This means that we have the rising in prestige all of the lawyers working in general in-house.
So just to compliment, hello everybody. So yes, so now I think we're going through every one of the topics of the research. And as Luciana was saying, changes in the legal profession, of course, mirror change, political, economic changes, and these are they rarely go uncontested. So in Brazil, we have a number of clashes going on between national, foreigner, between corporate law and traditional practices, and this will show in every aspect of the legal profession. So I think one of the good things in the research is that this is a way of better understanding this vague term globalization as it works in the legal profession. It's changing, but this is not a smooth process. It's really very heavily contested, and we are facing lots of perplexities or difficulties in Brazil, which might be of interest because not only because of the country, but also because it seems to us that it dialogues with what's happening elsewhere. And so we are going to go, I think, step by step here, right? And so Luciana, as Luciana said, the general in-house counsel is apparently the less problematic issue. The movement of becoming more prestigious and in-counsels, the in-house counsels having more discretionary powers to hire and not hire, and law offices is rising in Brazil, as I think Professor Wilkins has already showed. Happens elsewhere, but of course this goes hand in hand with a change in the perception of the role that law plays in Brazil, the law firms play in Brazil, and this will be, as we'll see, a very controversial area of debate. And then we have the regulation, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you can go on.
Okay, so as for the regulation, we have the The major point is to what extent Brazil has the legal capacity to meet its needs in terms of globalization. So we don't have enough lawyers skillful or apt to act or to practice international economic law, right? So there are two ways to solve this problem. One is to grow them in the country, and this will have to do with legal education. But is traditional legal education capable of doing this? The short answer is no. The long answer is no. so we're trying to revamp the whole thing, and this is going to be presented in a second moment. Now the other way is to bring foreign lawyers and foreign companies to the country, and of course the Bar Association is adamant against that, because they feel that if we start having American law firms, English law firms, European law firms operating in Brazil, I mean, really the best part of the market will be handed over to foreigners. And so we are in the situation in which we don't have the capacity, and we cannot hire the capacity. But that's what the bar is there, to create a mess, right? So at this point, this is one of the major tensions. I don't know what you wanted to complement on this one.
Yes, and also this is an issue in São Paulo and Rio. This is not some that don't have any importance if you go to the north of the country or if you go to the middle west, where we have a lot of, I think that it's the most law schools in the Midwest.
The highest ratio of law schools per city.
This is not an issue for the bar, for the regional bar association.
Right, and that's interesting because, well, for you to have an idea, Brazil is today, or it was, the seventh economy in the world in terms of GDP, and São Paulo state alone responds for 30% of that. So São Paulo responds for 30% of the economy, of the 70th economy of the world. And Rio, if you put Rio together, then you're going to get close to the 46%, right, that we're talking about. So that's the thing. The bar has to deal with this very sophisticated and global-oriented elite law firms in São Paulo and Rio. But to get elected president of the bar, you have to get the votes of all these other states, which Luciana was mentioning, right? Which have virtually no corporate interest at all. So in this sense, the tensions within the Bar Association mirror very closely the political tensions in other areas of the country. We just had a presidential election, which could more or less be portrayed along the same lines. So that's very important. This regional distribution is very important because it's not as if we had a similar economic activity throughout the country. So law plays a different role, and the bar has to strike a balance between this more advanced demands for corporate law firms and the rest of the country. And this also affects pro bono. Maybe you want to go on with pro bono.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it also affects pro bono and the building legal capacity, where you have also the government policies to build this legal capacity for the lawyers to deal with international economic laws. And but since the beginning of 2000 and since the beginning of the government Lula mandate, they changed their role in building legal capacity. And this is a very personal policy to build this legal capacity in, for example, in Geneva or in New York, where Brazil has their permanent, their continuous statute to prepare this kind of lawyers. And also, this means that pro bono could be can be done by the big law firms, and also it's some kind of protection for the market as individual work to do the pro bono, like Defensoria Pública or the joint venture with Bar Association, the government and the Bar Association.
Yes, Brazil has a long tradition of having law schools helping people who, poor people have access to justice. And this is so traditional that the government, I think in the 90s, right after the new constitution, right, created the Defensoria Pública, public defenders, who do exactly that. So when the pro bono movement gained momentum in Brazil, part of the government and part of the Bar Association were fighting against it because they thought they would be intruding upon their turf. And so it was a tension, and so as it is now, individual lawyers are disencouraged to perform pro bono work, right?
Mm-hmm.
For individuals.
For individuals, what they can do and what law firms do is they offer advice to NGOs, free consultancy to NGOs who cannot pay for them, but they cannot help individuals. And some public advocacy also has been performed in pro bono matter, but not individuals. So that's a byproduct of the political infight in Brazilian bar and regarding the professional turf.
Mm-hmm. All of these topics is showing that we have clashes, that the globalization clashes some different kinds of issue. First of all, the national and the foreign structure, the traditional and the new lawyering styles, and also with social strata, especially if we are talking about legal education, and the law firms and the law firms structure, and also the individual practice.
Right, yes. And so there's all these clashes, and in legal education particularly, I'd like to say a word about this. We can see very clearly the two sides of globalization. On the one hand, Brazil is producing a small number of elite law schools, very expensive, oriented to a global market, catering for elite students, and that has really very novel methodologies, and it's innovating a lot. At the same time, because Brazil lower classes moved up a scale and have a larger consumer market, the first thing people wanted when they went up the social ladder was a university degree. And law seems to be a very cheap thing to teach. As you say, it's spit and chalk, say in Brazil. That's the only thing it takes. It's not medicine or anything. So we had a boom of law schools in Brazil. Today we have around 1,100 law schools in Brazil. That's a large number, and most of them not very good quality, to put it mildly. The government doesn't seem to care too much, because this allows you to present very good numbers at the United Nations saying that everybody has access to the university. And they don't say what kind of education that is, but it shows good in the PowerPoint at the United Nations. At the same time, but this creates an enormous pressure, because you have more people with a law degree, and then you have more lawyers. We are really underskilled, to say the least, but can control the bar. So this affects the way that the bar functions, and they distrust this top law schools as if they were selling themselves to the American model of lawyering. So there is a lot of tension there. And in legal education, just to complete this thing in terms of globalization, now in Brazil we are having an important phenomenon. We have this project also, which is the Observatory of Legal Education in Brazil. Lots of open capital companies with a lot of American money and foreign money in it are buying law schools in Brazil. And so we have right now we're reaching the point in which around 1 out of 4 schools, law schools, belongs to such a group, which are usually very low budget. It's a scale gain they have, and they are having a major impact in Brazilian education. But this is something we might discuss. So again, I think what to sum up is that these clashes, they speak in the legal profession and the changes we have been having, the contradictions that characterize this process of globalization, which is not only happy-go-camping, but there are also problems attached to it. And that's the way things go, right? Here and elsewhere, of course. Yep.
Yeah, I think that is it. We can open for the questions and discuss this.
Tiago, why don't you say a few words about how you see it from your perspective? Maybe say a little bit about yourself and your firm and where you are, and then kind of how you see some of the issues that you've seen.
Can I talk a little bit about what they said?
Yeah.
Professor, thank you for the invitation. The last 2 weeks ago, we were together in Brasilia. We visited a few people, and it's important to say how impressed we are with the work that Professor David is developing. In Brazil, like here, we have most of the college focus on studying constitutional administrative law, but we've never been, at least myself and the Supreme Court Justice, never been faced with the kind of research that Professor David is holding right here with you guys. And we have absolutely the same view about the market, Brazilian market, where the general counsels they're gaining a lot of importance. They are already, and they're going to be even more important as the decision makers on our market. Like Professor Trubek said before, most of the investment in our country became around the 1990s and is mostly foreign investment. So when you look at the Brazilian market and try to understand the law firms that are there, especially we're talking about the big ones, they are very, they resemble a lot the law firms over here. Well, they try to do exactly what the law firms here do. In fact, most of the clients of those companies, of those firms, they come through the American and European law firms. I've talked to many of the managing partners of the biggest law firms in Brazil, and they tell me that most of the clients, important clients, are foreign company, and they come through the outside law firms, the big ones. So what our profession does, it basically does follow the money. So wherever there is the big investment, you're going to find law firms as big as the investment allows them to be. So Rio and São Paulo, even though Brazil has 27 states and it's a pretty big country, basically 2 cities here in São Paulo, they concentrate most of the lawyers and most of the investment in the country, like Professor Ghirardi told us a few minutes ago. And you'll not find in Brazil, outside those 2 cities, law firms as big as the 10 biggest law firms in Brazil. They're just gonna stay in Rio, São Paulo, and probably you're not gonna see another big law firm in Brazil outside of these 2 states. The market is closed. It's a closed market. It's my personal opinion, Professor Ghirardi. This market is still closed, and it's something that's not gonna hold forever, but it's still closed, mainly by the pressure of the big law firms. Because when you understand that the big law firms in Brazil get their clients from the big law firms in the US and UK, you understand that for them it's really, really bad if the market eventually opens, because you're gonna see those big law firms from US and UK starting to put together their...
Do you see that changing?
Changing, you mean?
Do you think there's any chance of opening up?
The pressure is very big, because you
loosening up the control?
The market is closed, it's very strict, but you start to see, Professor Trubek knows that the foreign offices, they find their way to be there. Yes. They don't have like the big offices, but they partner up with some law firms, and they say they're not doing any litigation at all. They're just talking to the clients, but inside the office they do most of the works they can do without the bar registration. So I don't believe that this is going to hold up forever. The market's going to open, and when it opens, it's going to reshape our market as well. That's my own opinion, because the lives, most of the lawyers in Brazil are single lawyers. They work at home using internet, and they make very little money. And for those guys, the opening of the market does not represent that much of a change. Okay. For myself, and I speak with no concerns at all about the market opening, because we concentrate our practice on the Supreme Court, Superior Court of Justice, and the regulatory agencies. We don't see that much of, at least if I'm wrong, I'll pay the price, but we don't see that much of a menace of the foreign offices coming to Brazil. But I'm as much concerned as Professor Ghirardi is about the quality of the law schools in Brazil. We've been together with the Ministry of Education, and he told us that for the last 2 years there has been not an authorization to any law schools to open the doors in Brazil, and he's closing many of the law schools because, as you said, there's a lot of law schools with very, very, very low quality of education. Let me see what else I can share that's important. Yes, Professor.
Go ahead, you finish.
Yeah.
No, as I was going to say is that it's as the research goes on, we started talking about how those big offices they work, and like you said before, the general counselors, they are dictating the amount of money the fees that are being charged by the office, and differently from Bill Volk yesterday from Latham speaking, that they get all the fees inside a big pot and they just share, like everybody inside the office is the same, every partner. In Brazil, I don't see that kind of format in any of the big law firms. In Brazil, the big firms, they look like a coalition of small firms inside, like many groups with partners with their own groups, some groups doing really well, some groups doing not that big, and they have different ways of sharing the wealth inside the office.
Thank you, Tiago. That's extremely helpful. Dave, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, to underscore one thing that's been said, because it sort of brings with clarity the sort of challenge that's now occurred. So what you have going on now are two fights in Brazil. There's a fight over allowing law firms, big law firms, to provide pro bono services to individuals, which has been blocked, at least until very recently, by the interests of the small lawyers who fear competition. So they blocked this deal. Now this has been thrown open by the intervention of the government advocates, and it's a little unclear where it is. But so that's a tension between the big law firms that are pressured by the corporations they represent to have a pro bono practice, and the small single lawyers who have a lot of influence in the bar because of the disproportion between the numbers. In other words, the big law firms are big, but the total numbers are very small compared to the size of the bar, which is over 800,000. Okay, so you have that tension. Then you have the tension between the big Brazilian firms, which are now up in the 300-400, the biggest, and there are plenty in the 100 to 200 range, between them and the foreign firms, which are afraid of exactly what you say, and so they want to restrict the foreign firms. Now, all of a sudden, there's a commonality of interest. That is, the bar says, we want to protect the small guys, and the big firms say, we want to keep out the foreign firms. And right now, in the regulatory fight, there's this bizarre alliance between these two very contradictory groups, where the bar has said, the big law firms have stopped, at least for the moment, pushing for expansion of pro bono because that causes problems with the bar, and the bar, in return for that, has gone along with placing very severe restrictions on the foreign firms. This is, as you say, totally unstable. It's going to unravel. When we don't know exactly how it's going to unravel, but the federal public ministry, which is kind of like a public attorneys general, has intervened and sort of thrown this whole thing open. So it's going to be very interesting to watch how it's, but you see how this sort of coming of this gigantic corporate sector, which didn't really exist in any real scale 25 years ago, has caused all this commotion and perturbation within the system. And it's an active and ongoing process that's quite fascinating to follow. And we're going to write this book will come out, and then everything will change 2 years later. But that's research. Okay, so I think we should throw it open.
So please, thoughts, comments, questions. I know we have some Brazilian lawyers here, including from Ghirardi, which actually been very helpful for us in doing this research, but also others of you interested in these issues. Yeah, Nick?
So I just have a question to understand this political climate story a little bit. Just who exactly is making the decisions about opening up to outside law firms coming in, or decisions about whether law schools open or not, or who gets to be a member of the bar? Is it the bar? Is it the judicial system, or is it the government, or is it some combination? Where's the actual decision point, and how do they kind of interrelate? Just so it's a little more clear in my head.
It is a combination, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a combination. I mean, the bar has a very important saying.
Also in the legal
But can the
education.
government like override the bar?
Well,
Not in Brazil.
I mean, not in Brazil, and you know what? And at this time, and this is one of the big fights we're having. The bar is working closely with the government on that one. And in legal education, the bar has its own interests, and not all of them quite clear. But so the bar and the government are pretty much in agreement with most of what's going on here. And one of the things actually that we have, one of the things to be observed, and many people in Brazil have been questioning, is that law schools shouldn't be a school for lawyers. That's a different thing, right? You don't just have lawyers coming out of law schools. You have judges, prosecutors, defenders, so on and so forth. And these other legal professions can't have a say in the way law schools are run. And the government so far has just paid attention mostly, not to say exclusively, to the Bar Association. So much so that the bar basically drafts a bill, and then the government proposes it as law. So, and this is creating extra tension between other legal professions who want to have a say in the way we educate legal professionals in the country. But right now, the ball is pretty much in the government and the bar. I don't know whether Luciana want to complete.
Yes, and also the Bar Association in Brazil have a very important role. It's the most important ranking for the law schools. It's prepared by the Bar Association. And also the Bar Association gives blue chip for the law schools all around the country. And these, and they are together with the government, say where and when you can open a new law school, and for what kind of reasons.
Yeah, but there is one caveat here, and that is in this fight over the restrictions on providing individual pro bono services by law firms, any law firm, which had been pushed by the large law firms because they wanted to respond to the pressure from their corporate clients. So they pushed for this. The bar resisted it. came up with a compromise which allowed only pro bono to impoverished NGOs, not just any old NGO, but the rule says that the NGO can't have any money to pay for lawyers, so poor NGOs. Now, you know, it's not exactly easy to administer such a rule, so one thinks that perhaps they're not sticking too much to the poverty test, right, of the NGO. How much money do you have? Oh, we don't have any money for lawyers. Oh, yes, well, why do you have this great big building? Well, you know, we spend our money on that, but don't have any money on lawyers. So, all right, now, the point is that the federal prosecutor, it's very hard to translate ministerial publico, there is no English equivalent. The public advocate, that's what I would translate it as, the public advocate in Brazil, which is a very powerful institution at federal level, has intervened challenging the constitutionality of this ban.
Because of a specific NGO from São Paulo, the Pro Bono NGO, which involves a lot of lawyers from the big law firms, from the traditional ones, put the Ministério Público in this fight.
But the point is that there is a possibility of challenging the bar.
Yeah.
That is, it's not totally, it doesn't have complete exclusive jurisdiction over these questions if it's going to infringe the Constitution. And that's why this is such a fascinating issue. It's now up in the air. Because as a result of this, they eliminated the regulation, and now nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. But there is tension here between the bar and the government over this issue.
So, Chad, did you want to say something?
No, I was going to say something first. Now I have the pro bono, but first about the opening of the market. A few years ago, during the Doha rounds, Brazil was pushed to open the market of law firms. And the diplomats from Brazil, they saw an opportunity to open in the market, bargain for other important things for Brazil in the international commerce. And it's a fight mainly taken by, it's not only the bar, but the big law firms. They have a lot of influence, and government doesn't want to fight either the bar or the big law firms. In Brazilian Congress, the profession with the most representatives is law. We have, out of 513 congressmen, I think 150 lawyers, something like this. So mostly of the people in Congress, they have some kind of bond with the legal profession. But the Bar Association in Brazil deserves a case studies. It's different from anything you've ever seen in your life. Because it is, in the small, first of all, the market in Brazil is different from the market here. So you need to understand that the market in Brazil is smaller, and that leaves the Bar Association with time to discuss many issues that are really not important for the legal profession at the corporate law. In the smaller states of Brazil, every lawyer pays a fee, a yearly fee. There is about $350. So with 800,000 lawyers, you imagine how much money goes for the bar, and the bar spends this money the way they want to spend. They have nothing to do with the money besides. I hope they don't hear that, because the thing is, I have some people, I have some lawyers in my office which have, which are part of the council of the Bar Association. But the Bar Association, the smaller states of Brazil, they have a political role. They support candidates. They are not focused only on the needs of the legal profession. They have a political role that is really important in those smaller states. And nowadays, to become someone inside the Bar Association, to run for the Bar Association, it's a few $10 million campaign you spend to become something in the Bar Association. So that says that Bar Association means something more than discussing the legal profession. Okay.
So just so you see what a multi-layered game this is, it's going all the way from the small states in Brazil and the elections for the bar, which turn out to be of political importance in some small way, all the way up to the Doha round. Yes, please.
I just want to add the political tension between OAB and the government. Like the Congress, they always threaten OAB to revoke the bar exam like when we have the political reform issue in the Supreme Court, when our big question the way the political parties fund their campaigns. The Congress treating the OAB, if you continue with the action, we're going to revoke the OAB exam. And just to have an idea how powerful OAB is, the idea of the government of the political reform was made by OAB, and was the president of OAB that went to talk with President Dilma and said, this is a good way of doing a political reform. What do you think? And she liked it.
Regarding the bar exam in Brazil, it's also a polemic issue because there's such a big rate of people that cannot get through the exam. It's about 80% of the people who take the exam they don't pass the exam. But the thing on the Congress in the last 3 years, 4 years, saying that it wanted to revoke the bar exam. That has another route, which is a personal fight between the majority leader of Congress with the Bar Association regarding an issue that they disagree, and that's something that he uses to pressure the bar exam. But I don't see the bar exam in Brazil going over, finishing.
OAB is the Bar Association, for those of you who don't know.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, the government does not support this. So every time any congressman put this article to revoke the bar exam, they work to convince them to vote against it.
And to understand the political role of the Bar Association, in 1992, Professor Ghirardi, when we had a president that was impeached, the impeachment process was started by the Bar Association.
Yeah,
so the Bar Association in Brazil.
But I think there's been, I don't know, Luciana, whether you agree with me and Thiago, there's been a change. When Brazil was under the military rule, the Bar Association had a very important political contribution to restore democracy. Now, after democracy has been restored, and that's, of course, my personal view, the Bar Association has been most of the time interested in its own gain. I mean, it has ditched aside major political issues in Brazil, and it has become a petty class club. So they're instead of the important political capital the Bar had for having helped restore democracy in Brazil, with a very, very commendable history of fight for rights. To me, and that's again a personal view, in the recent years has become narrowed to petty infight for more prestige, and with very little concern. I don't know whether you guys agree for the broader issues in the country.
Yes, and there is the same pattern with the other legal professions in Brazil, like the judges, like the public prosecutors. If you see the election from the judges, you just can see corporative issues.
Right.
And OAB is just like that. Although the OAB has a very particular rights in the federal constitution to begin some kind of things on the Supreme Courts.
Right.
So it's a very powerful organization, but with corporative issues nowadays.
Corporative issues in the sense of self-interest of this
corporation
within, sort of in the sense of corporatism.
Yes.
Right.
Because it was established, and a lot of this power was established in the period in which Brazil was essentially a corporatist structure in the 30s under Getúlio Vargas. That's part of the history of the embedding of the bar as basically an actor in the state, right?
Right. And that's terrible.
When the Ministry of Economy in Brazil says that the interest rates are going up, the Bar Association goes to the news and says, no, it's not possible. So you understand how far the Bar Association goes in Brazil, away from the legal discussions. But through our constitution, 1/5 of the Brazilian courts, appeal courts, not the Supreme Court, Superior Court of Justice, the members are appointed through a shortlist made from the Bar Association. So you understand how strong the Bar Association is. And until 3 years ago, the Bar Association used to appoint only members of the council. But then there was a public opinion pressure, and they changed the rule that nowadays someone who's sitting in the Bar Association Council cannot anymore be appointed in this short list for the.
At any rate, I think that the Bar Association nowadays should do a lot of soul searching, because it seems that it has become, as we have said, that this sort of a very closed and self-serving institution, and this also goes for magistrates and defenders, and this is really dangerous for democracy. When you have these key institutions in the legal system that are thinking more about themselves than what they can do to promote the rule of law in the country, this is dangerous, I think.
So let me just see if there are any other, this is fascinating, I have to say I've learned a lot about the Brazilian bar, but any other thoughts or comments or questions about other parts of the, I want to just give people a chance before to go away. I'm not going to call on anybody. I see one of my favorite students sitting over there. I'm not going to ask her to see what her perspective is, but yeah.
I wonder if you could talk about whether these elite law firms, whether it's a straight importation of the American model as they've matured, or whether there are still distinctly Brazilian connotations or aspects.
And Tiago, you started with that, and maybe you could say that, and José Garcez and others.
When you look at the big firms, the hourly base fees, the by practice group division inside the office, the ratio partner to associate, those are not concepts that were established by the Brazilian firms. It comes from when they look outside, they come outside, they look how the big law firms in US and UK work, and they import this frame. Okay, of course that they don't talk about the American law, the UK law, but even the discussions on US and UK law, they come to our context after a while. I'm talking about governance. I'm talking about compliance. They see what you guys are discussing, and after some time, this discussion comes over to our reality.
Yeah, I think that in this managerial structure, I think the import is direct. However, this top level, the borders between law and power are very fuzzy. And so you have this structure for elite firms that come from other countries, but still you have to have the political context and political expertise that has a particularly Brazilian flavor, with a lot of personal connections, personal ties. Who do you know in the government? Who's this? Who's that? And so, and this is not unheard of in this story of Brazilian institutions, in which we import a managerial system, but then you have to make it work within a very deeply rooted social logic that is not totally compatible with the structure you have decided in the first place. So you know what you want to.
Yes, and who do you know inside the courts, and how do you build your relationship with the judges and also the justice in the Supreme Court? And this is still exists as a very strong, powerful and issue to build the hierarchical structure inside the big law firms. Although you also have the foreign model, the American model of the professionalism inside the law.
So if that's the case, so if you have if you need this distinctively Brazilian flair to the law firms, even though they're importing American models, why are they so scared of foreign law firms? These foreign law firms don't have.
It's clients. Well, yeah, of course.
So just say one more word about what you mean by that, about why you say it's
No, I was going to say something to add to Professor Luciana, is that the thing about the personal connections happens everywhere. You have it here a lot.
Yeah.
The difference, the big difference, is that over there is in a way that nobody sees. Two problems we have over there. It's not clear, because over here, at least from where I say, okay, everybody, what is being done over the table, mostly of what's being done is being done over the table. And in Brazil, what happens is you cannot go through a case and win a case only through the connections. If you don't have the correct arguments, and if you don't have any point at all, it's not possible to win a case. But we still find a lot of examples of situations where you cannot understand some kind of judgment, and it still happens because of the personal connection. That still does happen. But the personal connection is a fact here, is a fact everywhere. It's just the way that, for example, in Brazil, you don't have regulation for lobbying. They make as lobby does not exist, lobbying in Congress. Over here, you have the name of the people, you have the rules, you have how much you can spend, you have which is what is allowed and what's forbidden in Brazil. Nobody speaks a word about it. You have offices as big as the building, only concentrate on lobby, but they do consultancy.
Yes, and that's a good point. And this, I think, goes a long way to explain why law firms are scared of or afraid of having foreign companies coming in, because this political contact is important when you get to litigation or you get to regulatory agency litigation. But for consultancy, that's irrelevant. And a major part, right, of this high-profile work is consultancy, kind of corporate design, more convenient. So yes, they would buy the big chunk of the Brazilian market if they were allowed to step in, apart from the litigation, right?
And it isn't as if they're going to come in with nothing but Harvard Law School, American-born lawyers. They're going to have local lawyers, and they're going to build their local capacity, and they're going to hire these people with the connections. That's the first thing they'll do. Oh yes, tell me about your uncle, And so it isn't as if and then because they have the clients will go to them because they know them, and
it's all about the clients.
It's about the clients, and once they have the clients, unless the bar. The first line of defense is the current system, which basically says you can't really do very much of anything except advise on local law. And the penetration of foreign law firms in Brazil is very limited right now when you compare it, say, with China, where there are like 31 foreign law firms active in Brazil, and probably no more than 100 lawyers total, because they're very small offices. Okay? Now, of course, they serve as kind of outposts for these gigantic institutions. But in China, there's like 300, I think, foreign law firms, right? And many of them are more substantial. So this is a very small penetration, and the bar is trying to make it more and more difficult and leaning more and more in the other direction because the threat is really great, and there are all these countervailing pressures, and through the WTO and blah blah blah. The Americans, I'm sure, are pushing, just as the British are pushing the Indians to open up the market. There's a lot of pressure coming from the in trade talks about opening up these markets because we've opened up the market for manufactured goods around the world to a very significant degree. So where if you're going to reduce trade barriers, where are you going to go? You're going to go to services.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right.
And so this, now we're talking a 10-year, 15-year perspective, but I think so. I think 15 years from now, it's going to be a totally different world.
I don't think it'll be anywhere close to 50 years. I think it'll be 5 years.
Well, it could be.
Because at some point, the Brazilian government is going to say, we'd rather sell more Embraer jets in the United States and screw the lawyers.
Well, you know
Now,
what?
this is exactly what happened in Japan. So in Japan, the line, it always goes in this way. The first thing is, no foreign office can be allowed. India is the most restricted. You have to be an Indian citizen, which means you have to be pretty much born in India, raised in India to be practice law. Then the next thing is you can have a foreign office, but it can only practice what's called home country law, which means if you're a U.S. firm, you can advise U.S. clients on the U.S. law aspects of Indian transactions, or that's why you're in India, or that's why you're in, let's take Japan. That was the next step. That allows some limited penetration, but it's limited because most of the deals require some combination of home country law, which after all you could get back in New York, and what you're getting on the ground. So then you get a lot of cheating around the edges, and the bar associations try to police that cheating, which happened in Brazil, where there was the whole thing between the Mayer Brown law firm and whatever. What was the name of the law firm? The guy came to our conference, remember?
Ivan, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So is it an alliance? Are they collaborating? So that's where the line gets maintained until it gets pushed further, in which case you can hire local lawyers who have to either give up their bar licenses and become consultants, or as in China, can't actually advise on Chinese law, but can only advise on the Chinese legal environment. If you could tell me the difference between Chinese law and the Chinese legal environment. Now, why does it get pushed? And then eventually you get full opening, as you're now having in Singapore and in Korea. Why does that move? Because at some point, the government gets in some trade negotiation. And what happened in Japan is they said, the U.S. government says, we want, opening the legal market, but we also want more U.S. beef and U.S. rice sold in Japan. So now the Japanese government is going to say, what are we going to do? And it turns out there was a funny imbalance of power that rice farmers and beef and cattle growers are way more powerful in Japan than lawyers, partly because the Japanese bar limited the number of lawyers by having a 3% pass rate on the bar. So there was actually only a tiny number of them. And on the other hand, in the U.S., lawyers are more powerful than rice farmers and cattle farmers, because there's a whole bunch of them, and they're infested throughout the entire government. So at some point, people said, okay, we got a deal. You get lawyers, we get less rice and cattle. And that's how it worked, and now the Japanese market is very low. Doesn't mean there won't be any more there are still big Japanese lawyers that are important. This goes to Brian's point. Because they actually, once they figure it out, they do have some advantages. But it did dramatically change the market. Anyway,
and the general counselors, they want the foreign law, the law firms, because the guys that they trust, the guy that they know personally. Mm-hmm. So it's less trouble, less work. Yeah. They have a better position just to keep with the same guys I know, and they share the responsibility of hiring with the CEOs and CFOs, which know the office, like you said, Professor. Everybody knows the big firms here. So if something goes wrong with a big U.S. highly prestige firm, it's nobody's fault. But if you get the local firm, nobody's here about, and they do something bad.
You never get fired for hiring for
yes. That's right. And also what Professor Trubek said about the privatization, it's important to say that it didn't go through 100%. There's many, many important sectors of economy which are still state-owned companies. And in Brazil, it's still an ideology issue, privatization. Mm-hmm. Every time there comes elections, someone say you're willing to privatize Petrobras, the candidate would lose like 20% of support, 30% of support.
Although everybody does, right? Everybody privatize. Left-wing governments have privatized more than so-called liberal governments.
Yeah, that's right.
So I think, look, we can just talk amongst ourselves, but I'll say this, and then if you guys have any other questions, otherwise we can just make it informal and folks can come down. I think the real question, because I know we have folks from Brazil, but also other countries where this dynamic is going on. So, you could end up with an equilibrium in which all the big local players who exist under protectionism, once the market opens, basically disappear or are bought up by the global firms. But I think that's unlikely to be the equilibrium for a couple of reasons. One is, and Thiago and all of our Brazilian friends really reference this, that, just sending in our man in China or just sending the way in which we do things in the U.S. is always going to bump up against local resistances. And even incorporating top local lawyers Some top local lawyers won't want to go because they actually don't want to work for an organization where they're really just an outpost and the headquarters is thousands of miles away. We've already seen people leaking out of the global firms to start up more local-based boutiques, which compete on the basis of access, information, local knowledge, expertise, relationships with, as the local companies become more important in the overall market, they also have sometimes an incentive, at least for local matters, to stay with lawyers and law firms which are more deeply rooted in the local culture. But then the last point goes to what Tiago was just saying, and which Dave and others, and José and Luciana also reiterated, which is the government is going to play a role in what happens. And in China, what we're seeing is the government is choosing national champions. So the government may not want to live in a world in which the only major law firms in Brazil are headquartered in London or the US or Bonn or something. And the Chinese certainly have made that decision, and they are driving the state-owned enterprises towards Chinese law firms and are pressuring some of the private enterprises to do the same thing, and actually are trying to build up the services sector, because legal services are always going to be in this hybrid between the public and the private space. So one of the things I think that'll be very interesting to see in Brazil, which has already shown a willingness to invest in development of local capacity in the WTO. One of our papers is around the way in which the Brazilian government has invested in its own development of legal capacity to represent Brazil in places like the WTO and other international fora. Will they support the legal sector? I was just in Singapore, in which the head of the Ministry of Justice gave a talk at the at the Asia Managing Partners Forum of the International Bar Association, in which he said 3 things in 10 minutes. He gave the best address on globalization and the legal market I think I've ever heard. First, he said, we're very proud of our Singapore law firms, and as a government, we think it's extremely important to have world-class law firms in Singapore, and we're going to support them. Full stop. But, number 2, Singapore is a global hub. That's how we have profited. We are friendly and open to people from around the world. Therefore, we will treat our global friends fairly and want them to come and be a part of our market. And therefore, they have eliminated all the restrictions on foreign entry. And then the third thing they said is, we're going to develop a world-class court and arbitration system here to attract everyone to want to come to build the Singapore service market. That's a pretty good plan, right? The question is whether we're going to see in places like Brazil and India and China this kind of public-private collaboration, which is both global and local, but still preserve some important space for this sector. And you guys, the students in the room, you're going to make it happen. So you're going to determine what's going on. So I think, can we just thank our terrific panel? If any of you are interested in continuing the discussion, and it does not just about Brazil or even India or China, but other countries where you might see some of these issues taking place, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you.